Hi everyone, my name is Atila, and today I'll guide you through this very exciting tutorial. We're going to paint this amazing Nordic Warrior. I'm going to follow the original concept work with a few tweaks. This will be sort of an advanced tutorial, but I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Okay, first thing, what we have here is my miniature primed, and I already did some pre-shading. To do this pre-shading, I used my airbrush. I used a black primer, and next, with my airbrush coming from above, I sprayed with white paint. I use pre-shading mainly as a reference, because in the end, I'll cover up everything. Also, by doing a pre-shading, I have an easier time when I'm filming the miniature, because it's easier for the camera to focus. But before starting, let's go back a few steps earlier. What we have here is the miniature, and I used paper clips to pin the miniature. This step is completely optional, but if you want to give more strength for the miniature attached to the base, a good practice is always to pin your miniature. It's easier, just make some holes in the foot, next you use the same drill to make holes in the base, next you cut a piece of the paper clip and then you put it in the holes. I prefer to glue the paper clips in the foot of the miniature and then glue to the base. For this I'm using super glue. The drill must be a bit larger than the paper clip, so you have some room to insert the paper clip inside of the hole. Okay, so let's start with the red part. I'll begin using deep red from scale 75 and cover all the red parts. I'm diluting this paint using water with a mixture of 50-50 of paint and water. Scale 75 paints are thicker than the regular paints like Vallejo or AK Interactive, and a bit thicker than GW paints. Just so you have an idea, this is the consistency I'm working with the paints. It's not too thin and not too thick. It's a sweet spot. It's a consistency that I can push the paint around and not leave brush strokes. Or the opposite, when you have the paint too diluted and you can't control it and it goes everywhere and go inside of the cracks and recesses. Now I'm going to mix pale blue from Vallejo with violet from Chimera. It was too dark, so I added a few more of the pale blue and mixed again. This will be the base color for the blue parts of the clothes. I decided to go a bit darker with the purple. Now I'm going even darker in the shades. I'm mixing this purple with a bit of black. Now I'm mixing the sand yellow with phthalo blue from Chimera. The idea here is to use the blue tones to be our mid-tones, the shades will be the purplish tones, and we're going to get lighter using yellow in the mixture. So the idea here is to avoid the recesses. Let's focus on the raised areas. Then next, the concept is simple. We will just make the colors lighter by mixing more yellow to it, and we're going to reduce the areas we're applying the color. So you can see now I'm applying, not covering everything I did in the step before. In the squares of the sleeves, it's easier to spot where I'm applying the paint. I'm applying the top half of each square. Now I'm going to switch a bit the color. I'm going to use the pale blue from Vallejo. You may think this is a big leap from the last color we used, and it is. But I'm doing this to increase the contrast, and next I'll try to blend those two colors. So no worries if the transition looks a bit harsh. But still I'm following what I said before. I'm reducing the area where I'm applying. Now, by mixing the violet with a bit of black, I'm going to increase the contrast, but in the shades. For the cape, I use the very same techniques and paints I use for the other blue parts of the clothes, starting with a darker tone and going up until the highlight. Now I'm using pale blue again, but this time with my airbrush. The idea here is to smooth the transitions between the pale blue and the purplish tones. We will lose a bit of the shadows in the process, but don't worry, it's easier to cover lighter colors with darker colors than the other way around. Now I'm glazing over with my phthalo blue from Chimera to recover a bit of the saturation of the color. If you don't know what a glaze means, it's basically a very diluted paint applied with a brush applied very carefully. This will form a translucent layer and will slightly tint the place where you apply it. Now it's time to mix the blue with a bit of white. With this mixture, I'll paint the highlights in very small areas. Now another round with the phthalo blue glaze. Now I'm going to use a mixture of white and phthalo blue, both from Chimera, and I'll use a bit of a different technique. I'm going to start with the lighter color, then I'll move to the mid-tone, and then I'll go to the darker tone for the bottom part of the cape. What I'm doing here is using the wet blending technique, which means I'm applying the colors, and while they are still wet, I'm mixing them on the miniature. I'm wet blending them. This technique is very good for larger areas, like this cape. Then you wait for the wet blending layers to dry, so you can have a good idea, because the colors tend to go darker when they dry. In my case here, I'm gonna push the highlights a bit further by applying more layers with the mixture of white and phthalo blue. And I'll push the highlights a bit further in the sleeves too. Now let's go back to the red parts. I'm using Alderan Red from scale 75. The idea here is to cover the upper areas and leave the recess untouched. Here I'm using Sunset Purple from scale 75. I'm basically painting the shades. Now I'm using Alderan Red mixed with a bit of white and I'm highlighting the upper areas. Again, the transitions will be a bit rough, but we're going to smooth it later. The idea of this step is to define the direction of the light. So the only thing that matters now is the direction of the light. It must be consistent through all the red parts and of course the rest of the miniature. So it's not necessary to worry about creating smooth layers right now. If you do one step at a time like I'm doing here, if you make a mistake in the direction of the light, it will be much easier to fix because you don't need to worry about smoothing the transition. And also you don't fall into the trap of caring too much about the work you already did. You can easily fix your mistake. Now I'm using Antares Red from scale 75 and I'm going to smooth the transitions. You're noticing I'm covering some of the previous layer I did. The idea here is to cover a part, but you need to leave some of the previous layer untouched, at least for now. Although it's easier to think about reducing the area and increasing the lightness of the color, here I'm showing to you that you don't need to follow these rules. You can go light first, then dark next, and then mid-tones, so there's no right or wrong. You need to paint the way you feel most comfortable. In this part I realized I lost some of the highlights, so I came back with a mixture of Alderan Red with white. And then I'm immediately wet blending with a mid-tone, which in this case is Antares Red. This mixture of red and white, you will notice that will dry much darker, so you need to wait until it dries to judge if the highlight is strong enough, and you'll probably need more than one layer to make the highlights pop. And something else I'm doing here that I forgot to mention is I'm using like dots instead of brush strokes. This is to create a bit of texture for the fabric he's using. Now I'm glazing some violet from Chimera to intensify the shades. Now I'm using a dark brown to paint the base color of the wood. This is a cheap Brazilian craft paint, but just as a bonus I'll say the name of the color in Portuguese, which is rústico. I also decided to use the same color to be the base of the beard and the hair. Here I'm using natural sienna as the base color, again using a cheap craft paint from Brazil. Here I'll use a contrast paint, which is a dark brown called Dark Oath Flash. I'm applying like a wash, covering everything. For the shield I'll use a different product from Games Workshop, which is a brown wash, Agrax Earthshade. Now I'm going to paint the stripes of the pants. First thing I'm going to use an ink from Liquitex to sort of mark where the stripes will be. Also I'm using this ink because this is a translucent paint, and this helps because I want to keep the values of light and shadow that I did previously. Although the transparent ink kept some of the values of light and shadow, I need to bring back some of the highlights or else they will not match with the red parts. So I mixed a bit of the dioxanite purple ink with acrylic white. I'm using scale 75 white. Now with pure dioxanite purple ink, I'm intensifying the shadows. When using inks, the more layers you apply, darker it gets. And then I switch back to some midtones, mixing the dioxanite purple ink with white, with more or less in the mixture. Again with the dioxanite purple, I'm going to apply it to the recesses. And here with the mixture of Alderan red with white, I'm going to do the edge highlights. Here I'm using sand yellow and I'm marking the highlights of this leather part. Now back to the dioxanite purple ink, I'm going to apply some shadows. Now again with the natural sienna, I'm going to paint between the lightest color and the mid-tone, but I'll not cover completely any of them. Did you realize I switched the order of the colors again? I started with the highlights, then I moved to the shadows, and now I'm going back to the mid-tones. Now the last step here is to apply a wash using Sepia from Games Workshop. This will act like a filter and tint everything and pull back a bit the highlights. I'm using this mixture of red and white to paint some of the strips around the boot. I'm using a very small brush, 3/0. Again with natural sienna, I decided to paint the fur around the cape. Now I'm going to apply Games Workshop Agrax Earthshade on all fur parts. Now I'm going to mix all these colors to create his skin tone. So here is what it looks like on the palette. I'll start with a lighter tone. With some lighter tones, I'm going to highlight a few parts of the face. There's not much to paint in the face department here, but we must highlight everything properly. Now let's begin with the non-metallic metal. For me, the easiest way to do the non-metallic metal is to start with a dark base, like this one, which is black in my case, and next I put all the lights using white, like I'm doing now. Some call this technique sketching, which follow the same idea as when you're drawing and you're doing the sketch, which is the base for your final drawing. In this case, this is the base for our final lights, and then we're going to smooth the transitions as we go. For the midtones, I created a mix of white and black, and I added a bit of blue to create a bluish gray. Now with white again, I'm going to use dots to smooth the transitions. This is like tapping with the tip of the brush, creating very small dots to create the illusion of a smooth transition and also create some texture. Now I mixed a darker mid-tone, using more black in the mixture, and also always adding blue. I don't know if you realized, but the black part is not touching the borders anymore. With the darker gray, I draw a line at the bottom. This is to simulate that the very light border at the bottom is kind of reflecting over the shadowed area of the circle. And with black, I'm trying to contour all the recesses around the circle and around the smaller circle in the center. To paint the leather parts of the belt, I'm using red leather from scale 75. I'm painting more towards to the bottom area of the belt because those are the shadows. Now here in my wet palette I'm using orange leather and I'm mixing it with yellow and a bit of white so I desaturate the color a bit. All paints involved are from scale 75. Now I'm with the orange leather for the mid-tones. By the way, the scale 75 leather and wood set is amazing. I'm not being paid to say that or anything like that, but I really like their products. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Hopefully nobody will listen up to this point in the video. So the idea is to smooth the transitions and I'm adding a bit of the brown leather mixed with the orange leather to create those transition tones. I don't know if it's just me, but I found very satisfying when I'm passing a lighter color over a darker color and it immediately covers up. Man, it feels so good! At this point, what I did is painting smaller areas in the highlights using more yellowish tones. I mixed yellow with the orange leather, and now using burnt umber ink, I'm going to intensify the shadows. Now with a mixture of yellow and white, I'm going to highlight the shoes. And with the orange brown, I'm painting the mid-tones. Now I did a mixture of yellow and white, I'm going to do some texture in the edge of the cape by doing strokes. Now I'll highlight the upper areas of the fur. And here you can also see in the shield that I already did the metallic parts. I used the same idea as I used in the disc at the front of, and the same for the border of the shield. The top is lighter with almost white and the bottom is almost black. Now I'm using white and a bigger brush to sort of dry brush the texture. It's not really a dry brush because the brush is loaded with paint. Normally in the dry brush you use very little paint, but in my case I want to create a bit of texture too. And also I'm concentrating the lighter colors at the top, and we'll do a more gentle dry brush at the bottom, so the paint doesn't pick as much in the lower area of the shield. The idea here is the top part to be almost white, but we need to apply this paint in a dry brush way so the recess doesn't get any paint. So you shouldn't force the brush too hard or else you will paint areas you don't want. Now I'll cover everything with sepia wash from Games Workshop. After this step, you must wait until it dries completely. Now with white, I'm going to make some edge highlights in the wood. Now I'll cover everything again, but this time I'll use sepia ink from Vallejo. Now to paint the chainmail, I'll use white, but the trick here is to use the side of the brush and the paint a bit thicker. This is called overbrush and is similar to the dry brush, but you use much more paint. The idea is to avoid the lower areas. Here I'm already mixing a bit of the gray to create the initial transitions. This is the same bluish gray I used in the other metal parts. Here I'm going from the lightest color to the darkest. At this point of the video, I was very unhappy of how the blue turned out. It was too saturated and wasn't fit well in the composition, so I decided to repaint everything. I first covered with a coat of pale blue from Vallejo, and then I mixed with blue, black and white to create the darker and lighter tones. I'm not going to show everything here because it was the same I did before, but with other color. If you are painting tabletop quality, I don't think it's worth doing what I did. But if you are more towards the display quality, don't be afraid. If you painted once, you can do twice. And you can see that mistakes happen at any point of the painting. Okay, with this out of the way, let's go back to the shield. The idea of this shield is to look like it was painted with yellow. So I did all the wood effect and now paint with yellow over it. But I'm using the overbrush technique to avoid the deeper areas. So this was a change I did from the original design. If you can see the original artwork, the symbol that appears in this miniature is in the circle on his belly. So I decided to move it to the shield. My idea here is to make this shield like it's a wood shield painted over with yellow, not that it's made of yellow wood. Now we use an ink from Liquitex, which is raw sienna. This will be our first shadow. The inks can cover some of the recesses because they will dry a bit transparent, so we won't lose too much of the shadow work. Next I mixed yellow with white to create the highlights. Now back to the midtones, and the midtone I'm using is Oxide Yellow from Chimera Paints. Now I'm using Warm Yellow from Chimera. Now back to the Sepia ink from Vallejo. And for the upper part of the shields, I'll use Seraphim Sepia from GW. Now with Seraphim Sepia from GW, I'll cover everything in the shield, at least all the wood parts. So now let's draw the symbol. What I did here is measure, sort of measure, where the lines converge. And what I'm doing here is use black paint and connect the dots. Now is a matter of increase the width of the strokes, and this is the reference I'm following. Now with white, I'm highlighting the edge of the wood. Now for the hair and beard, I'm overbrushing with oxide yellow. For the helmet, I'll do the exact same I already did for the rest of the non-metallic metal parts. So here you can see the shadow and the highlights are defined. Now it's a matter of smoothing the transition. The mid-tone is a bluish gray, which is black, white and a bit of blue. Now let's paint the eyes. I like to start with a dark tone for the eye socket, so later I can paint over with white and this white will become a bit gray. If you paint white over a lighter color, the eyes will be too bright and will look a bit weird. Here I already painted over with white. And I left some black borders. The final step is just a matter of put a black dot in the middle of the eye. For the final touches, I'll glaze over the non-metallic metal parts using a red tone. This is Blood Red from scale 75. Now using Druid Violet ink from Liquitex, I'm going to lightly spray on the bottom part of the cape. Some call this technique as airbrush glazing, which follows the same idea of the regular brush glaze. Create a very thin and light translucent coat on the surface. I'm also spraying some Agrax Earth shade, which is a dark brown. And here is our final result. But first, let me address a few things. I didn't go through each individual step of the miniature because there are a lot of repetition in the process, like the non-metallic metals, the wood parts, leather and so on. But the two buttons holding his cape, if you're wondering which colors I used, they are the same ones I used on the shield. The red stripes on the blue parts in the cape follows the same idea as the stripes on his pants, but using red instead of purple. So that's it for today, I hope you enjoyed the video and see you in the next one. Abração e até mais!